Welcome back, guys. At this point, we have basically completed at least the bulk of our configurations. As we go along, we may see the need to include other things, but right now we want to start actually making our API work, because outside of hitting F5 and seeing Swagger and seeing the logs, nothing works, right? We don't have an API just yet. So what we want to do is actually start configuring our GET endpoints, and I'm going to explain exactly what the GET endpoints mean. So to start us off, we're going to just look at this weather forecast controller that came with our project, but it is actually just some sample code that kind of provides some context as to what we need to do to get our GET endpoint up and running. So our controller, like I said before, actually controls what happens when a user requests information. It hits the controller. The endpoints are usually determined by our what we call actions, which are these functions that are going to be defined inside of the controller. And what it responds with, or when the action is hit rather, it does its computation and then responds in a manner that the calling application or the client application that is trying to access the API will know that this was a successful call. Maybe, and generally speaking, whenever somebody calls a GET command, it is in order to retrieve information, hence the word GET. They're getting something, or they expect to get something. So within the context of this sample controller, we see that when we call this endpoint, it is going to return data. So we are getting data. Granted, it is very random data. It's nothing too serious. But the reality is that it is doing the simple command, which is getting. So we have what we call this HTTP attribute, right? And it is saying, it is defining the behavior of the function. So when we actually test this out, and we can do that right here in Swagger. We just go ahead and pull this down, and they show us all of the examples of what we might get. We can click try it out and click execute. And then it's going to now show that this was the request that was sent. So notice there is no real indicator here to say, oh, this /get. There is no indicator to say what the endpoint was. We know the server based on the fact that when we run the application, that's our server address. And then we know the controller that we're interacting with, weather forecast, right? That's the name of our controller, weather forecast. Controller is a static keyword. Every controller, that's just a naming convention. But then I don't know which action it hit. So what really happened is that, and I'm just going to set a breakpoint here so we can see that when we click execute, it actually hits that breakpoint. So it's calling this method, and it's called GET. And when I press F5, it just returns with all the information that was being retrieved from that. So what's really happening here is that based on the protocol and certain definitions that we're going to be making here on each action, the way we formulate our requests, the control will automatically know which one we should hit. And the context for this, the background behind this is that you don't want to get too granular with your names for your actions. So you don't want to say get all, get one by ID, get one by name. You can actually call the action basically anything you want to. So you can give it its own name. Of course, there are standards surrounding that, but the reality is that if you have multiple gets, you can't name all of them the same get. But you based on the data that is required to retrieve the information, you can stipulate which get should get called. So all of that, once again, this is just the introduction. So in the next video, we're going to create our own control, and we're going to start off with the with the countries, and we'll see exactly how it goes when we want to retrieve the countries, the listing of countries from the database through an API call. All right, so now we'll be constructing our first controller and our first GET operation. So I'm going to right click controllers, go to add, click controller, And then we're just going to do an API empty controller. So just choose API to the left and API controller dash empty. And we're going to click add. Now, just for some clarity, we have gone ahead and abstracted a lot of the database operations into our unit of work so that we're not directly interacting with our database through our controllers, right? If we did API controller with actions using entity framework, then it would actually generate a controller which has an active object of the DB context, which is the database connection, and we would be able to do all of our entity framework work right here. The danger of that, however, is, well, danger in the long run, it may become less maintainable as the requirements grow, because then you're going to end up repeating a lot of code, which is why we went all the way over to our unit of work, abstracted away all of that, made it very generic so that we have one code base that we're just making more dynamic calls to. So for now, I'm just going to deal with the empty one because we really don't need to go ahead and scaffold this one out. But as we build out the application, you will see the practicality of all that we have done. So API controller dash empty, go ahead and click add, and then the name. You generally want, once again, the name to reflect the endpoint, because just like with weather forecast, we know that when we hit URL/weather forecast, we expect to deal with weather forecast. So if I expect to deal with the hotels, sorry, I'm starting with countries. I keep on saying hotels. So we will have country, or we could say countries controller, right? I'm going to say country. All right, country controller. And then we get our blank controller. Now, a little background behind what you're looking at in this controller, the root. So we have two routing mechanisms that we can use in API development, at least MVC API development. One is the convention-based routing, right? That one is where we actually have to go to the startup and we would configure in use endpoints. We would kind of configure a route. So I could say endpoints.map controller route. There we go. And then I would kind of define the naming convention. So I could say name, colon, and I'll just say default. And then the convention for the routing would be the pattern, right? What should a route look like? And I'm just showing you this. This is not the one that we're going to use, but I'm just making sure you understand exactly all the options that are there. So we'll have controller, and then the sample would be equals home, right? / action, and for example, index, and then / any parameters that would be required or not, in the form of the ID. All right. So, and this should be in curly braces also. So this would be our way of defining a convention-based routing schema. So that way, anytime a request comes in, that request needs to specifically state that we're looking for this controller by that name. In, for example, weather forecast controller, or that's the endpoint we hope to look for, but we want this specific action. So I did mention that we don't want to get too specific with our actions. We don't want to say get countries, get country, get country by name, get country by, and we just list them out and we have 50 actions, and then the calling client application has to remember the action to be used with each call. So that is what this would kind of force us to do. So and that's probably more useful for a web application, a regular MVC application. But when it comes to the REST API standards, what they want is for the verb to determine what it is that you are going to be doing. So then we are going to be using what we call attribute routing, right? Which is basically just going to say, look for the controller, and some, if we wanted to modify this, you could say API slash controller. So whatever you put here is what is going to come after that server name being localhost colon whatever port you have slash whatever root is here, right? So if you look back at weather forecast, well, we're at weather forecast, that's what's there. So it was that slash the controller being weather forecast. If we look at our new one, we see that we have slash API slash controller. So then the links will look slightly different. So when we generate the Swagger doc, you'll see that coming to light. But right now, what we're going to be using is the attribute based routing. All right. So it allows us to map directly to our controller and directly to the actions without being too specific about which exact one. But then the verb is going to determine what endpoint should be called based on the request and the details. So now that we've gotten all of that background, let's actually wire up our first GET. So before we can do anything else, we have to include our private read-only unit of work so that we can take advantage of the database access. All right, and I'm just going to call this one underscore unit of work. So this is my naming convention where I use an underscore, and you would see it at other places too. We use an underscore for private variables, and well, you'll see as we go along. So we need that, and I'm just going to put on the logger. So logger. After that, we need to go and set up our injections. So I'm just going to quickly copy and paste these so that I don't have too much retyping to do. So once again, dependency injection means that once we have registered, and on that note, we need to go to the startup and complete a configuration. But once you have registered something in the startup as a service in the Bootstrapper, it becomes available for injection in most cases, right? So for our controller, we can just inject an instance of the unit of work, and we'll just make a copy of it for local use. So that's what this is for. And we'll do the same for the logger. All right, so we have our local copies of those. Now, the thing that we need to do in the startup is to actually register the unit of work. So we created it, but we didn't register it in the Bootstrapper. So I'm going to leave it, and I'm going to show you the error that you would get, and then we can resolve it together. All right. So moving on, after doing those preliminary things to configure my constructor, I'm going to define that I want an HTTP, and you can see all of the potential verbs being listed out there. So HTTP GET operation. And to complete this operation, I'm going to be using a public, and I'm just going to go async. So public async task of type iAction result. All right, so if you had generated the controller with the ASP, with the entity framework already added to it, all of them would have been task of iAction results. So you just get it async out of the box. So it's good to just start using async from the get-go, right? Now I can name my action get country. All right, and that's fine. I mean, well, in this case, I want all countries. So get countries, because I'm getting multiple, right? Once again, based on our routing, we don't need to specify that, but you'll see that later on. And then our task now is going to do a try catch, right? So we're going to try an operation and handle any error that we might get, and I'll extend this with the EX so that we are actually catching the exception object. And then here I'm going to say var countries is equal to our unit of work to call the countries, and then I can say get all. All right, looking good. Now remember, with our method, we could put in an expression here if we wanted to add a filter, get companies where this, that. We could do quite a few things from this method alone, but right now we just need all. All right. And then I'm going to return. So the return types are very important, right? You want to return okay when everything went all right. That's why it's called okay, right? Or 200. So the status number is 200, and we can return the okay with the data. All right. So that looks good so far. We're going to be modifying it a bit in a few, but that's what we're going to try and do. And then if everything goes okay, we return okay, and it's going to send back to the calling client whatever data came back from this call. Now in our catch, at this point, our logger becomes very important. So logger.log error, and then I can say something like $, something went wrong. And I can say, I can put in more details in and so I'm going to use my interpolation. That's that $sign there. In case you're not familiar with it, $, string. It allows me to superimpose any variable at this point. So I'm just going to kind of specify the name of the method where whatever went wrong, right? So name of get countries. All right. And then I'm going to pass in the exception object. Actually, I have that backwards. The exception should come first in log error. Apologies. So it's exception, comma, then something went wrong, or exception, then our message. So Serialog will actually just flesh out or print out the entire stack trace so you can see all the details of the error from the exception that has been thrown. Now, if there's an error, I don't want to just throw. What I want to do is alert the client that something went wrongly. So yes, the logger says it. That's for our internal purpose. But then I want to return something to the user to say, this is what happened. So status code 500 is the universal code to say there was a server issue. All right. So this is telling the user that something went wrong on our part. It's not you, it's me. All right. So then the status code 500 means internal server error. And I'll just say, please try again later. All right. So that's what our client or the client consuming the API will see when there's an error. Otherwise, they should get the list of countries. So let us test this out. All right, so the first thing you'll notice is that now our new endpoint has been added to the Swagger. The second thing you'll notice is the difference between how the links look. So /weather forecast versus /API/country. Once again, that has to do with the route that we have defined up here, whether it's API/controller or it is just the controller name. All right, so it's dynamic. So at any point we can go and remove the API if it's too much of a bother, but we'll leave it for now. So let us say try it out, and then we click execute. And what do we get? So firstly, that's the request URL. So the server, right, /API/country, and we're getting this error. All right. So it's actually spitting out to our Swagger the entire response to say unable to resolve service, activating this, and you see that it's getting a 500 error. All right. So we told it return a 500 whenever something bad happens. Another thing to notice though is that I'm not specifying the name of the function being called. So before we fix that error, notice I'm not saying /API/controller/get countries. It is only calling slash API slash country. The user doesn't know the name of the method being called and being, sending back the response. So that's another thing that when we talk about the routing convention, because we specify that it's a GET, it automatically formed it out to be a GET command. So we're going to fix the error, and then I'm going to test it again using Postman, which should provide a little more context as to what we mean by GET versus post, etc., etc. So to fix this error, we need to register our service, like I said before, in our startup.cs. So in the startup, we need to say something like services dot, and I'll add transient, a unit of work. So you would see the different scope options. You have add transient, add scoped, and add singleton. Yes, sometimes I forget, right? So I think we've done an add singleton before. No, we haven't. All right. So add transient means that every time it is needed, a new instance will be created. Add scoped means that a new instance is created for a period or for a lifetime of a certain set of requests. And add singleton means that only one instance will exist for the entire duration of the application. So based on your needs, you might end up doing different ones. So add transient here means that whenever somebody hits my controller, I'm going to always create, or this is always going to provide a fresh copy of the I unit of work. So let me just go ahead and include the missing references. And then let's try that request again. So this time I'm going to use Postman to handle this request. So I'm still going to try it out only to show that, okay, so we're getting an error for the logger. And okay, let's fix that. So it's good to see these errors, so at least you can tell why we can try and troubleshoot why we're getting those. So I think the issue with the logger is that it has to be injected with the context of the class it's being injected into. So in this case, it would be the controller. So I'll just swap this out. So iLogger within the context of, and I'll just change where we see weather to country controller. All right. And then let's try that once again. All right, so we're going to try it with Postman this time. So I'm just going to enter the request URL, which once again is just the local host colon the port number that you have, and then slash API slash country. Now, when we talk about get versus post versus put, with Postman, we can actually try to change the type. So remember that we built it to be a get. That's what it is designed to be, which means that if I attempt to call this same endpoint with a post, it's going to give me a could not get response. And okay, I'm getting something because of the SSL. So you can just go ahead and disable SSL verification if you're getting that issue. All right, there we go. So method not allowed. Method not allowed means that it sent some request and the verb that was requested does not exist. All right, so if I try get and then send again, note I'm getting a 500 and I'm getting another error. All right. Oh, we're getting some good errors. So I have this concept of good errors where it's good to see these errors and understand how to fix them, right? So this one is saying that system.text.json is giving an exception because a potential cycle was detected. So the background to this is that because of the dependency on hotel has a dependency on country, and country has that dependency back to hotel. So what it is saying is that, well, I'm getting hotel which has country and country has the hotel. So I'm seeing a lot of data going from side to side. So let's fix this one. I've encountered this one before. So let us go ahead and fix this. To do that, we need a library, manage new get packages. And we're going to be getting the newtonsoft.json library. But not that one. We want the Microsoft ASP.NET. Let me just type in Newton Soft That's not the one we want. We want this one, the one that is optimized for our purpose, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and install that one. All right, and once it has been installed, what we need to do is go to our startup, and we're going to, on our add controllers, we're going to add Newton soft JSON. There we go. And define some options. So O lambda arrow. I mean, you can call it option if you want. Any token is fine. Lambda arrow. And then define that OP dot serialize. There we go. Serializer settings dot reference loop handling is equal to, and I'll just break the line so we don't get too far off screen. So the serializer settings dot reference loop handling is equal to newtonsoft.json dot reference loop handling, and then that's an enum, so we want to say ignore. So where you see that, we're basically saying where you may see a reference loop happening, don't make a big deal out of it. Just ignore it, turn a blind eye, and let the program run. All right. So another thing, and I'm just going through and correcting any little mistakes that I made. Here, we're calling get all. What I didn't do was await. So cardinal rule, whenever we're calling an asynchronous function or something that's a task, make sure we await. All right. So let us try this again. All right, so going back to Postman, we're going to try and send one more. And this looks a little bit better. There we go. Status 200, okay. All right, so once again, our status 200 is a universal sign that everything is okay. And instead of us having to say status code 200, they just gave us a method for it. Unfortunately, they don't have a method for the 500, or at least I haven't seen one as yet. So that is why this one looks that way, and we can just say okay with the data to be returned, and it will automatically be serialized into, there we go. All right, so notice that we have each property coming back, and hotels, well, that's empty for now, right? Because we didn't include the hotels, but we can do that later on. So that is how we handle a get. Now we have one more modification to make, and that is to do the mapping. So remember that we don't want to return the actual domain object. So as right now, get all is returning country, and country is the database object. What we want to return is the DTO. So we want to return country DTO. And then, well, later on, we'll see how we can extend the DTO to be a bit more, or make it make sense as to why I'm going to go through all of this trouble, because clearly the data model, the domain model as a return type worked. But then we still want that segregation. So I'm going to just say country DTO. We're going to map to it. So we need our auto mapper in order to do that. And to get auto mapper, I have to define a private read only called of type IMapper. So I'll just go ahead and include that and then do the injection. All right, so after we inject it, then we are going to separate this a bit. So we're going to say var countries is equal to that call, and then I'm going to have another variable under that and call it var results is equal to mapper.map. Then I'm going to specify the data type I want to map it to. So I want to map it to a list of type country DTO, for which I have to include a missing reference. All right. And just close that angle bracket. And what I'm mapping is countries, which is already coming back as a list. All right, so whatever data type it is that you're getting back, you have to make sure you map to that appropriate data type. And then all of that, so it's just going to take all of the domain objects and convert them into country DTO objects and store it there. So if I didn't specify iList, I would get an error because this is a list and I'm trying to, well, it would give an error regardless. It may not give you a syntax error, but you can see that the data type is not quite what I'm expecting because I need a list, right? So just be very explicit inside of this map section that you're mapping a list of this, or you're getting that and you hope to map it to a list of that data type. And then instead of returning the countries, we'll return results, which is of type country DTO. So at this point, if it is that we wanted to leave off some details or include more details, we could have defined those additional fields in here, done whatever calculations we wanted to do in here, and then they would never really see what's coming directly from the database, but we would have sanitized it, transformed it, embellished it as much as we want before we return the data. So let's just go ahead and test and make sure that this one works, and then we're done with this task. So back to Postman, we're going to say send. So it's going to hit the same method, and right now it's bringing back. So here's proof that it's bringing back something different, because remember, hotels was at the bottom of the list initially. Now ID, hotels, name, then short name. So you know that the data is restructured only because the fields in country DTO are in a different order than they are in the domain object. Either way, we can see that it's still working, and this is how it really should be. So when we come back, we're going to look at how we can get a specific country based on maybe the ID. Let's start with the ID. All right, so previously we configured our get method, and this is really the get all method, but it's not all the time that our client application wants to get everything. Sometimes they want to get specific data. All right, so we want to at least provide them an endpoint where they can get one country based on a particular unique identifier, in this case the ID, right? And just for context, since we're building the API without the context of the actual client, if you saw a list of countries and you wanted to see the details of one of these countries and you clicked view, then what would happen is that it would go back to the database and get that specific country to display the specific information or details of that particular country. All right, so that is the same thing that we want to provide an endpoint for, so that when on their side, when the user clicks the country, they in the background will say which country was clicked here, which ID is there. Here's the ID API. Please may I have the details? And then we say, okay, we'll do the lookup. Here are the details for that particular country. So without any further delay, let's get to it. So I'm actually just going to copy that original get. All right. And we're just going to make some minor modifications. So the first modification would be to the attribute. So yes, they're both gets, right? But this get in particular needs to know that it can take a parameter, right? And this is really, it has a lot to do with documentation purposes, and it's good so that when people see it, they can infer at the same time how it differs as it goes along. So you can define the get, but then you open and close brace, and then inside that you define the template for the get. So I can say here that I'm expecting some parameter called ID, and it should be of type int. So if we wanted to get by name, we could do something like name of type string. All right. So you know that this get is going to take this parameter name, and the names are very important, and that data type, which is also very important. Next, we are going to have to rename this. I mean, get countries. This isn't getting countries. This is getting a country, and it is taking a parameter ID. So like with any other method in anywhere else in C#, once you're calling a method that you have to pass a parameter in, you have to define the parameter that it's expecting. And notice that the name here matches the name that is in the attribute. All right. So get country ID. Now we have the same try catch, but then we're going to change up the query and the mapping a bit. So one, we're not getting countries, we're getting country, and we're calling the same await unit of work countries, but we're calling the get method. All right. And our get method, notice the red line, the get method requires the expression or the stipulation behind what exactly it should be getting. So we have to define in this the expressions. Remember I said that the expression is really going to be a lambda expression, so I'm going to pass in that same kind of lambda expression where we say token, lambda arrow, and then what am I looking for? Q dot, and then I have all the fields of the table. So this was designed for the countries, right? So what field in the countries table should I be looking for? I'm looking for the ID, and my condition is that the ID in the countries table matches the ID coming in through the parameter. All right. And then in the same way, I can include, because I'm just thinking about it. If you ask me for the country within the context of this, somebody clicked on the country, I figure that maybe you will want to see all the hotels for that particular country. So while looking at the list of countries, you only want to see maybe the list of countries. However, when you look at one country, you probably want to see the hotel, right? So, or hotels. So I'm going to say new list. So I'm going to pass in a new list of type string. And I'm going to add to it. So this is how we initialize a list. And then we can just say that I want to include hotels. So once again, this is now going to go over to our unit of work. It's going to hit the, let me find the method, which is in the generic repository. And it's going to hit the get. So this is the expression. This is the includes. So it gets all the records. Then it says if there is any includes, go ahead and include whatever you need to include the hotels, right? And then we're going to look in the query, take off the tracking, and return the first or default record that matches. And default really means just return null if you can't find anything. But the first record that matches this expression. So the expression would be where q.id is equal to the ID value. It will do all of that computation and just return the one record to country with all of the hotels that are available. So I'm just going to double check with my domain just to make sure that the thing is called hotels, because this has to match. Just the same way in the country DTO, it has to be hotels. All right. So now that we've done that wiring up, I'm just going to change up my mapping. So I'm getting back one country object, one object. So I'm not going to map to a list. I'm just mapping to country DTO. So that's a one-to-one mapping. And I'm just taking off the S's and fixing the plurals and the singulars just so that the code is self-explanatory. We shouldn't be calling these countries when we're only getting one, right? So I'm just trying to make sure it's readable. All right, and then we're just going to say something went wrong in the name of get country. All right, so let us take this one for a spin. So you see the gets are really straightforward, right? We did one there and we just took the code, and with a few modifications, we're potentially done with it. So let's see what. So the first thing I want to bring your attention to is the documentation. So you see API/country, and then you see API/country/ID. So that ID being displayed there is courtesy of our annotation here. All right. And then if we drill down into it, you see that they're actually saying that the ID parameter is required. No two ways are about it. It's required, right? And if we say try it out, we can put in that. But I'm going to use Postman to test this one out, right? So when I say get, right, with Postman and the same endpoint and say send, I'm getting back the original get, which is getting the list. Now, when I modify this endpoint and I say /1, right, and then click send, look at what I get back. So I'm getting back only one result, and this is the ID, and it's the list of hotels, which there's only one hotel associated with hotel number one. Sorry, with country number one, there's only one hotel, but this is an array. So if there are more, then all of them will be listed under that property or attribute, and then the name is Jamaica and the short name is JM. So you see our second get is working. So let me just put a breakpoint and show you exactly what is happening when we make that request. So putting a breakpoint there and then clicking send again. Breakpoint is activated. If we look in the parameter listing, we see our value 1 coming over. All right. And then we can go ahead and I'm going to use F10. So when you use F10, it doesn't go into all of the method calls. But then if I look at the country object coming back, you see hotels, and that's the list with only one, the ID, the name, the short name, and then we do the mapping. So now result has all of the data that was just in country, and then it's going to return the OK with results. So it's automatically going to deserialize it into, well, serialize it into JSON layout. All right, and right there, we're done with our second get. So now we know how to get all, and now we know how to get based on a particular requirement. All right, guys, so I'm issuing a challenge to you. I want you to pause the video. Yes, it just started, but go ahead and pause it. And I want you to go ahead and create a controller for the hotels. You can call it hotel controller. And the functionality that we have just gone through with our country controller, I want you to replicate it in the context of the hotels. So I already have it here, but I want you to pause. We're going to go through it together, but I want you to pause, attempt it yourself, and then we compare notes. All right, so I'm back. And I'm saying I'm back because I'm assuming that you paused the video and now you're resuming and now we can go through it together. So here we have the hotel controller, and I went through the same steps. I right-clicked controllers, clicked add, did a controller, a blank API controller, called it hotel controller. I went ahead and injected basically the same services that were in the country controller and initialized them in the constructor. Now, everything pretty much is identical. The only things that really changed were my variable names, because obviously I'm not going to call this one countries if we're getting hotels. So get hotels instead of get countries, get hotel instead of get hotels. And similarly, you'd want to get a hotel by ID. Another thing that I would want to point out would be the mapping. We're mapping to hotel DTO, and the final thing would be that I've kind of added more attributes. So as we see, the attribute kind of it indicates to at least Swagger, and I mean it does dictate the behavior, but Swagger does depend on it also to know how to formulate that documentation. So right here, I'm letting Swagger know that this method produces 200. It also produces 500. Because if you recall, when we looked at Swagger and it returned the 500, you would have seen something saying undocumented underneath that 500 error. And so we want to just make sure that Swagger contextually tells as much information to the developer as possible at any given time. So when I bring up Swagger, you're going to see the segregation, country, different from hotel. All right. I hope you're seeing this. And if we look at hotel or any one of these that the attributes was, both attributes were added to, you'd see that the 500 wasn't there initially. You'll see the 200 now, 500 wasn't there initially. All right. So that does work out for us. I'm going to use Postman to do some testing. So I still have my test from the time. And the thing is, with Postman, you can always just start a new tab, right? So instead of using one tab to continuously be changing, I'm going to have one for the get with no parameter. Let's drag it over here. So this is no parameter. Let's see if that works. All right, so I really didn't test my code before now. I wrote it and I didn't test it, and I'm happy to see that it's working. All right, and then the one with the parameter, that also works. And for now, that's all there is to setting up our controllers. All right, so as many controllers as you might have, of course, variations and based on context, certain things may differ, but we have a good template upon which we can build our get operations. All right, so you can go ahead and, just state this off. And then when we come back, we'll be pushing our changes to our repositories.